And it's also difficult to see whether people can actually enjoy the fact of traveling to a certain distance. That's what we call the dilemma between the scarcity and the commodity value of time. And it's also, yeah, and spatial sorting, finally, it's also another problem, is that people who actually decide to live close by, close to the environmental site, well, obviously, is because they already had a higher, they attached a higher value to the site itself. So we have some sort of confounding effect there as well. So the third big families of valuation technique is the stated preference one, and it's probably the one that we use the most with John and Peggy. We apply these sort of techniques quite a lot in the research that we do. So in stated preference valuation, we use survey data. We interview people. Well, we do most of our work through the internet, but through surveys. And so stated preference valuation had the great advantage that they allow us to calculate use and non-use values. And the big subfamilies that exist are contingent valuation, choice modeling, or deliberative group valuation. So the first one, contingent valuation. Well, valuation is actually contingent on the hypothetical scenarios that are presented to them. So what does that mean? It's like people are being asked in the survey, what would you be willing to pay or willing to accept in case we would modify that piece of nature in a certain way? Would you be ready to pay an extra tax? And if you are, how much would you be ready to pay per year? This sort of thing. So it works by designing a survey with some hypothetical scenarios, establishing what sort of willingness to pay mechanism people would be ready to accept. Obviously, we run a couple of tests to see whether that works or not. And yeah, you need to imagine like a means of payment, so like an annual tax, and whether you, with the contingent valuation, whether you will use a set of questions or just like one question. Are you willing to pay somewhere between $0 and $100 a year? Or are you willing to pay 100? Oh, okay. And what if you, if people say no, would you be ready to pay like half the price, this sort of thing? So the different, the question can be asked in different ways. That's basically what I was trying to mean here. And yeah, so you need to select like a certain target population, trying to be representative of the overall population. And so you collect your data through the surveys, and then eventually you can calculate your willingness to pay through some econometric modeling. So here is an example for yeah, that's a water quality improvement of a certain lake in Wisconsin. And you can see the sort of way that they have constructed their contingent valuation scenario is, so we had, this lake had a problem of a pollution problem with phosphorus. And the idea was like, okay, how much would you be willing to pay to reduce the amount of phosphorus entering the lake by 50% over the 10 years? So obviously cleaning up has a cost, and to cover this cost, well, you might be needing to pay a certain amount each year over the next 3 years. So respondents were shown this sort of card, and they picked the amount that they might be ready to pay. And the idea was that, yeah, at the end they got to the value of about $354, and since they had covered about 155,000 households in that certain neighborhood, well, they got to the overall value of the overall willingness to pay of about $55 million. And since the expected cost of the the whole cleanup process were estimated to be about 18 million, well, that was actually useful for decision making, because that meant that local authorities could go ahead with the project, that they were sufficiently supported by the local community. So another way is to construct, is to look at discrete choice experiments. That's the second subfamily of stated preference methods. So here is an example that, it's from an experiment that I conducted in Belgium a few years ago. And it's basically, well, you present your survey respondents with different scenarios, and each scenario contains a number of attributes that describe the modifications that you want to bring to a certain ecosystem, for example. So here we had modifying this kind of habitat that we would have there in certain ratios, like increasing heathland or coniferous or broadleaf woodland, increase biodiversity, increase accessibility, this sort of thing. And you always have a certain price attached to each scenario. And the trade-off between those different attributes and the payment vehicle is actually what allows you to calculate willingness to pay for a certain attribute eventually. So that's a sort of experiment that we are currently conducting with my supervisor, John Rolfe, at the moment on the Great Barrier Reef. We have different options where how much would you be willing to pay in order to see coral or seagrass improve in quality and in extent, and in terms of amenity. So would you be ready to pay to see the recreational value or the touristic value of the reef increase in a certain way? So we are applying that at the moment to look into these aspects as well, the environmental value and the amenity values of the reef. Other choice modeling techniques that exist, very briefly, contingent ranking. You can actually rank different options, or you can actually rate different options from 1 to 10 using like Likert scale. And you also have like pairwise comparisons, whether people prefer one option versus another. Yeah, and similar to that, we have the best-worst scaling technique, which is it's one that we are currently applying as well in a survey about meat preferences at the moment, looking at sort of thing that people agree most or least with. And finally, the last subfamily of stated preference method is the deliberative group valuation. There, the assumption is that instead of asking people individually what's their willingness to pay is for improving certain piece of nature, why not putting people together around a table and discussing what that value is? And so that relies on collective knowledge and collective intelligence. And it's assuming that you can put the different stakeholders that are related to a certain piece of nature and a certain issue, and push them to discuss with each other and reach some sort of consensus. And it seems more effective in reaching that sort of consensus value in that sense. And it's useful to understand like the fairness dilemmas also over different ecosystem services allocation, for example. So it's also a very useful method. So just a word about the advantages and disadvantages of stated preference valuation techniques. It's the only way to estimate non-use values. It's participative because we do surveys. And in that regard, it's also quite flexible. And it provides detailed information, at least in the case of the discrete choice experiment. The disadvantages are that it's obviously stated preference, and there's always a difference between what people state they would do and what they actually do. so it's somehow biased in that respect. It's relying also on people's judgment, and psychologically it can be biased in many ways, in the way that we ask the question, or if it's face-to-face interviews rather than through the internet. Well, the interviewer can also have an impact on the person being interviewed. There's fatigue effects or other effects that can kick in as well. The design, the implementation, and the analysis can be challenging sometimes, and the data collection can be quite expensive because every time we need to undertake a whole survey. And as a potential solution to this problem, one last family of evaluation techniques that I want to talk about is the benefit transfer. So basically, it's if you want to value a certain piece of nature, and you do not really have the financial means to conduct surveys or like a proper analysis like the ones we've just seen. Well, what you can do is just looking in the literature for certain studies that have applied some of these techniques, and you can apply either the values that they found or the value functions that they have created to your case, adjusting for local parameters, and that would give you an approximation as well of the economic value of that particular site. So, and you can, if you want to go one step further, and instead of just relying on a single study, which would be obviously very biased because the geographic and socio-economic contexts vary a lot from place to place. Well, you might run a meta-regression or meta-analysis so that you go through a whole bunch of papers and reports that have calculated some economic value for that type of natural ecosystem, and you combine all that into a model, and that's what you do to calculate the economic value in your particular case. So that's what they did here with the case on wetlands in Europe. They constructed that meta regression. There's actually a website that has been created to compile all the valuation studies that have been done worldwide, and yeah, so that's this espmapping.net. That's actually to facilitate this benefit transfer exercise for people who would be looking specifically for all the studies about forest or all the studies about coral reef ecosystems. Well, they can find that here, or they can also find studies based on a certain type of ecosystem services, for example. Here again, just some pros and cons. It's obviously very fast, easy, and inexpensive. That's the main aspect of benefit transfer. But obviously, when you apply certain numbers or certain functions that were developed in another context, well, that's kind of dangerous in a sense that it might not fully apply to the context that you're looking at. So that's and you need to account for like the local and spatial parameters of the site itself that differ from one place to another, and that's what we call spatial heterogeneity. You also have problems like scope and scale sensitivity. If you apply certain values per hectare, say, that were constructed on a very small area, but you want to suddenly scale it up to like a much bigger ecosystem, well, actually your values may be totally overestimated, for example. So there's a number of parameters that needs to be included and controlled for in order for it to work. But otherwise, it's a very inexpensive way of doing nature evaluation as well. So just a few take-home messages. We've seen that environmental economics is a useful decision support tool for our leaders, like through the cost-benefit analysis. It can empower local communities by making them aware of what the environment provides to them, something that they might not be aware of in the first place. It also helps bring social justice because it internalized some externalities that were not properly taken into account into the market price of certain goods and services extracted from natural ecosystems. We've seen that the ecosystem services is a useful framework that simplifies a complex reality of environmental problems and helps us realize about the different goods and services that we benefit from as society directly from natural ecosystems. We've seen that there's actually different types of values, so like the non-use value, the use value, well, the direct and indirect values and so on. So measuring all of these can be challenging sometimes. Fortunately, we have different valuation techniques. Certain are way more adapted than others, depending on the situation. So it's important to choose them wisely and on a case-specific base. All of them, as we have seen, have their pros and cons. But overall, they are flexible tools that can be used locally or globally, and in Australia or in Europe, worldwide, through benefit transfer, for example, we can use studies that have been carried out very far away from here, but that still makes sense to apply here. So it's very flexible in that regard. And obviously, that's a very recent and vibrant area of research, so there's still much to be done in that area. That's it for me today. I'm just putting these books, like this one that I have here as well, The Pricing Nature, and the Natural Resource and Environmental Economics one. Those are extremely good books if you want to look a little more into this these valuation techniques and the way it actually works. I don't really have time to expose that today, but I hope it was at least interesting to you. And that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Jeremy. I suppose if we've definitely got a lot of time for questions. We've finished it right on time, really. So you can either ask a question directly, just simply unmute yourself, or in the chat to the right-hand side there in the chat function, you could ask a question there, and Jeremy and I can answer that. So are there any questions from the audience? Still.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to work with you. Can you hear me? Or?
Just a bit louder, lead away. You're just a bit faint.
Oh, I'll just bring the laptop a bit closer. Is this better?
Yep, perfect.
Thank you so much for providing the presentation. I did have a question in regards to the sheet that you mentioned, the correlation between environmental features and the pricing in, for example, the housing market. How do you include in that assessment any other influences, or how can you establish a correlation when there's so much more, I guess, that could influence that pricing?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's probably the biggest limitation with this sort of technique, is that you need to do some sort of screening exercise prior to developing your hedonic pricing function to actually make sure that you limit the potential amount of overlap and different degrees of correlation between the parameters that you will include in the model, because certain variables are just very correlated one with another. So it's definitely a challenging exercise. I'm not really like an expert of that one. I've been mostly working on the stated preference valuation techniques, yeah. But I reckon it's really powerful in the sense that it really allows you to extract that value that, well, this aesthetic or amenity values from the environment, and that is there anyway. It is very, very well captured in real estate price, but indeed you need to take the local context into account as much as possible, and that's where it gets complex. But there are people way better than me to to explain this sort of thing that have done this sort of analysis. So yeah, I should leave it here.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Thanks, lead away. I've got a generic question for you, Jeremy. What do you think are the, like you're obviously from a European background, do you think that this environmental cost of nature sort of in terms of usage in everyday policy is used more in Europe than say Australia, or how would you compare Europe to Australia in this field?
I have to be very careful with what I say.
You'll be right.
My understanding of it is like the European Union, the European Commission, has already done some pretty good work in adding these valuation techniques into a whole bunch of studies done at the whole European level. So I know that these techniques are well established over there, and they have already made their way through the whole policy structure over there. So, but it might be due to the realization as well, in at least in Western Europe, that we have damaged the environment. We have transformed the environment so much now that there's a real need and a real hurry in trying to take care of what's left. And in that regard, that's perhaps why it's been not considered a priority in that sense in Australia, because just talking in terms of population density, and Australia has so much more natural resources in that regard, and that yeah, it might still take a little while before it's being adopted entirely.
I can probably add a tiny bit to that. In Europe, the European Union requires a lot of cost-benefit analysis to be done for major projects and for lots of regulation, particularly around anything dealing with water. So these types of studies are regularly conducted. Whereas in Australia, there's only the one regulatory framework that really requires cost-benefit analysis, and that is where there's major new legislative reforms or major new legislative introductions. They often will require cost-benefit analysis to check there's no adverse impacts on society. And sometimes in big projects, so big infrastructure projects or mining projects, they'll require it. But there's not quite the same drivers here in Australia as there are in Europe.
Yeah, thanks, John. Are there any other questions from our audience? We got to Jeremy, or to John, or to Peggy for that matter, in this space. Major, did you want to add something? I think someone's... It's unusual for you not to have a question, Daryl, but...
Man, I don't know where to start, actually. I made a comment in there that unfortunately our environmental values are very much subject to political and profit-taking whims. In the Wide Bay area, and especially, for example, Hervey Bay, we have Fraser Island, which is a World Heritage Area. It's all part of the Great Sandy Biosphere, which has huge sustainability and world-class values, but we're basically letting everything go to pot because we're just not game to do anything about it. The potential for the future for maintaining the environmental values, the sustainability of all these things, including the professional and recreational fishing industries, tourism, all sorts of things, is just being let die because seems to be in the too hard basket. And I guess one other point, I was wondering why, in terms of our economic valuation of things, we can't put in some sort of thing like a sustainability index to illustrate the value of what we could preserve or what it would cost in terms of sustainability for the future. That'll do for the moment, Ben, thanks.
Okay, so just on the point of sustainability indices or indexes, do you have any experience with those, Jeremy, or are there many things in other markets or even in Australia?
Well, the only experience that I have somehow related to that is the work that we've been doing for the Gladstone Healthy Harbour partnership, and where we developed real metrics to assess how the port is doing environmentally, economically, socially, and culturally. So yeah, we've been looking into different metrics to actually assess the level of sustainability of that. Of actions taken at that level, and it can be tricky as well, because when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, is like you have to be careful of what comes out of that index that you are developing, because it's easy then to be taken very straightforwardly by policymakers who say, "Oh, look, we've developed this sustainability index that no one knows exactly what it's made of," and suddenly it says like we're all doing great, and it can be used as an argument to, you know, just to say like, look, we've actually ticked the sustainability task that we have in front of us, and so it's definitely a step in the right direction, but then it gets it may become technical, because the way you actually construct these sustainability measures is also subject to a different bias, and it can be misinterpreted very easily. So it's quite important to be very specific of what you use. But sometimes that doesn't even really change what policymakers intended to do in the first place anyway. But at least that's a way to clearly show that, look, there's maybe value in doing things in a more eco-friendly way. I don't know, maybe John, you want to add something to that, because you definitely know GHP more than I do.
I think Daryl raised two issues there. One was, what is this being done enough? And the second is, can you use sustainability measures? So there is quite a bit of action in sustainability measures, but it's difficult. With regard to the first question, I sit on the science panel for the Great Sandy Strait, where you know, they're looking at any adjustments to rezoning in the Great Sandy Strait, and that's the typical type of a problem where rezoning would be good for the environment, so to achieve higher environmental values, but it might impact on recreation, particularly recreational fishing. So we've got two things that we can't measure values for very well, and trying to assess the trade-offs there, and don't have and there's not a lot of case studies around to help with that. So and that's where you know, even if you go to a sustainability approach, trying to work out, you know, how do you trade off between the environment or a happy community, you know, or livelihoods of people. They're really tricky questions, and that's where the economics can help a bit.
Thanks, John. Any other questions there from the audience, from our guests today?
Yeah, Ben, Graham here.
Hey, Graham, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Hey, it's a, I don't know, it's a bit of a quandary, I suppose. In the out far northwest here, we've got the industry of tourism, agriculture, cattle, and the resources, mining resources out there. Each one of them have their own needs and wants, I suppose, as they go ahead. But the environmental side of it all is taken into consideration. But like Daryl said before, the policies of government and, you know, the big dollar dictates of what happens with that. How do, like, go back to tourism, I suppose, and that one there, councils have tourist ventures going forward out there, and taking consideration, as say Jeremy put in there about taking consideration how much are they willing to pay to come and things like that. It's a big thing for councils to try and put that together, but when they do their cost benefit analysis, the environmental side of it is not as high. How do we overcome that?
So when you say not as high, it's not as prioritised as highly, or
yeah,
what?
Yeah, the priority isn't as high as what is well, the cost is going to be what benefits is going to be benefiting the community. I suppose it does help the community, but it's not a direct environmental issue.
Over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I mean, there's some actions that can be taken and that would rely on the different valuation techniques that I have exposed that could help push the environmental agenda. For example, if you know that in the certain community a lot of people go there in the weekends to fish with their kids, then maybe they might actually be willing to pay a certain fee so that they can keep fishing in that place, and they keep and that serves to actually maintain the environment over there in a right condition. And so that's a way to sort of bridge the gap between tourism, recreation, and the environment. And we might be heading towards this sort of solution in more and more in the future. Something like, yeah, you actually pay for the sort of service that you get by enjoying this place, and it actually helps the local council to take care of it. So it's just well, I guess it makes sense. Does that does that answer your question?
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying. The point is that many of our councils are struggling even financially now. So if you're going to, in a environment or community that has been struck hard by drought and other impacts, so if you're trying to add another fee on top of that, it just makes it even harder for that community.
I understand that. I guess this environmental valuation techniques is not the panacea. It's not going to solve every possible problem. It's just bringing water to the mill. Like, it's just drawing some possibilities on how to integrate those issues in policy making, and introduce maybe some possible tools to actually finance this restoration or conservation of environmental aspects. But I do understand that it's a very difficult position that many local authorities may be in, because they need to give priorities to what seems to be most important economically for the community. And if the case is not properly made that the environment actually produce a lot of benefits to the local community, then it's not going to be really taken care of.
Thanks very much for that, Jeremy.
Welcome.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Either put in the chat or unmute yourself.
Ben, it's Daryl Stewart again. As an ex-pig farmer, I don't want to hog the stage, but Jeremy in his Gladstone Ports Corporation report mentioned about report cards, which is absolutely wonderful because it takes into account the present condition and then is able to compare it with a previous condition. So in 2008, I think it was, there was a study done on all the rivers and creeks entering Harvey Bay and a report card given on the usual parameters. That was 2008, nothing's been done ever since, so surely the value of that is just negated because we don't have anything to compare with what's happening now.
I think that'd be a John Rolfe question because it's more his area in terms of longitude of time, I suppose, in terms of this region and understanding. I'd throw to you on that one, John.
So report cards are designed to report at regular intervals, and the idea is you condense all of your monitoring and your science information into something that's easy to understand, and then by doing it, say, annually or every 2 years, then you can compare and you can identify changes. If for instance, the report card was done again, 10 years later, and the same parameters were assessed, then the comparison would be useful. But if it's only done once and it's never repeated, then yeah, it's got limited value.
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, John.
Yeah, I would add to that it has information value, the sort of exercise that we do, producing report cards, and as John said, producing some valuable information to support certain ideas, certain proposals to that can lead to more eco-friendly, environmentally sustainable decisions. But that doesn't mean that's gonna be enforced eventually, and that's a general comment that we could make about economics in general. Yeah, so we only have some sort of advisory role in that respect. It's not because we come with some brilliant ideas sometimes, or to influence decisions in a certain way that they will be embraced eventually. But that's a different area of, of power. In fact, the people who actually have the ability to use this information to actually make the final decision.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. Rightio. Well, we've hit about 1:15. I don't see that there's heaps of questions coming anymore, mainly because you've done such an extensive job on your presentation, Jeremy. And Jeremy, you'll be able to share, I know it'd be quite large, but would you be able to share a link or upload it to a Dropbox or something like that for the audience or for other? There's a few people that couldn't make it today to share with them. Okay. And yeah, that'd be quite useful. And if anyone, Jeremy's got his email there, if anyone's got any questions on that, I'll by all means get in touch directly with him. But I think it's been a fantastic job, Jeremy, a very interesting space and quite a complex one, but it's good I think it's good for everyone to get an understanding of how these environmental and nature costs or benefits can be put into an analysis. And as you said in your last slide, it's probably going to be a fairly vibrant and active space for the coming years, particularly for us in regions. So I'll sort of close everything off now and thank everyone for their attention and remind everyone that most Thursdays going forward, we have a webinar of the same or similar sort of topic as discussion. Next week, we are talking around digital connectivity and comparing two studies done by Rural Economies researchers in the far west, or the far west Diamantina and RECoE, and far north Queensland, but definitely around the bigger topic of digital connectivity with some economic and qualitative analysis there. So by all means, please feel free to join that. But thank you so much again, Jeremy, for your time today and your preparation and hard work in putting this together. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you in future RECoE events going forward. Anyway, thanks a lot, mate.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Andrew. All take care.